You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. I'm Jill Waterman, the show's creative producer. I'm also host of our new monthly series, Picturing World Cultures. A photographer's work hinges on access. This is an underlying thread in the tapestry woven in this week's show. Our discussion covers multiple facets of Indian society as seen through the eyes of a photographer with a knack for being in the right place at the right time. Starting from his visual diary of 60s-era hippies launching a counterculture invasion, we trace the rise of an agency photojournalist with a front row seat to historic events, both triumphant and tragic. Our guide on this journey is Pablo Bartholomew, a self-taught photographer born in New Delhi in 1955. His father, Richard, was a noted art critic as well as a photographer, allowing Pablo to learn photography at home at a very young age. In his subsequent career of nearly 50 years, Pablo has documented societies in conflict and transition while also recording intimate details of his own generation maturing amid a changing India. From 1983 to 2004, his photojournalistic work was featured in every major international publication, from National Geographic to Paris Match and beyond. Pablo's photographs have been recognized by World Press Photo on 3 different occasions, including a 1985 Picture of the Year award for his riveting image from the Bhopal gas tragedy. In 2013, he was awarded the Padma Shri by the Government of India for his contributions to photography. And in 2014, he was honored with the status of Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres by the French government. Pablo Bartholomew, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So I'm very curious about the many facets of Indian society you've captured over the years. While you were born and raised in India, both your parents were immigrants. You've noted that this family background and your cultured upbringing has allowed you the freedom to look at India with unattached engagement, without bias towards castes, religion, or regional points of view. With that in mind, can you briefly describe what you consider to be some of the defining characteristics of Indian culture and any changes you've perceived in this during your lifetime?
I think the one defining aspect of Indian culture, which is invisible, and that makes it even more difficult for an outsider to really understand, is the caste system. And very briefly, in the old days, the caste system had a hierarchy with the religious Brahminical end of it at the top. Then you had the kings and the rulers, followed by the merchants, followed by various castes and subcastes which made up some business, some crafts, and then you had the outcasts, which did all the terrible dirty work like cleaning up the streets, the toilets, etc., etc. And the caste system continues to be as rigid to this day in some form or the other. It's not there all the time, and people escape their caste because they move to urban centers and they can't be distinguished. However, there are giveaways if you really want to look, and there are people who want to look because they want to differentiate and make that difference for whatever their belief system is. And I think that's terrible. I mean, even within, let's say, the Christian community, the Sikh community, there is a caste system that still continues because these were people who were converted from Hinduism. So the Brahminical end of it, the high priests would end up having a better fare than being somebody from a low caste.
Interesting. And you mentioned that one way to escape the caste system would be to move to an urban center. So has urbanization shielded?
To some degree. The thing is that there are giveaways. It can be name, it can be the way you speak, economic bracket, all of this sort of has a role to play.
Right.
So you really don't escape it, yet you escape it in some manner, and that's the unfortunate part. The problem is that the politicians keep drumming it up because these are vote banks. There are politicians that prey on castes to give them their vote. And sometimes it can become very dirty. Then there's appeasement where you'll have a minister from that caste being inducted into that party that is wanting the vote. So it's all very mired and complicated and complex. And coupled with religion, which is the second thing, we are principally Hindu. However, we have a huge Muslim population, and unfortunately, the Muslims have been marginalized and pushed into a corner by the current dispensation. So these are really the two things that continue. I mean, we are very modern on one end, but we are very casteist and religious fundamental in another.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned politics, and I know there were recent elections that were sort of mixed. Has that been a complication?
Well, what it did, this election, was kind of give that signal that people are fed up with caste and religious politics. And the ruling party that was hoping to come back with a thumping majority didn't even make it to a majority. So it's had to use its allies to create a coalition government. So, in one sense, yes, that's a great thing. However, a wounded animal can always turn and become even more aggressive. So, I don't know.
Right. That's an amazing metaphor. So let's transition to talking about some of your work. Your earliest work was basically a visual diary with intimate views of family and friends, which happened to coincide with the rise of hippie culture and a large influx of young people from the West in the 1970s. How significant were the effects of this counterculture group from the West on mainstream Indian society at that time?
It all depends where you're looking and how you're looking. And there are two aspects to it. There was my age group.
Right.
We were very influenced with the long hair, the bell bottom jeans, the music, and of course the drugs, which the Westerners came to seek in India. This was Nirvana land. The Beatles came, and religion and meditation was another part of this whole thing. So, in that sense, globally, there was a lot of influence, and we were influenced by that. However, within the Indian context, we were sort of a small, let's say, middle class, upper middle class group of people who were able to induct and imbibe and get, Jimi Hendrix records and the Doors and Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead, all of that sort of stuff. So it was niche. I think at that time, if you looked at the French movies and the way people dressed in Iran or in Afghanistan and India, the pants, the shirts, the dancing, all of that was universal across the board into Europe. However, after that, things started to close. You had Iran close up, you had Afghanistan close up, and the mullahs got the better of all these nations and locked things up. India has remained fairly liberal until now, it's less.
Interesting. So in 1975, there was a photo series you made about a morphine addict, which won you a World Press Photo Award. Can you give us some backstory on that series of photographs? Where were they made, and how did you gain access to that situation?
So, The hippie movement started to go into decline sometime, let's say, 73 onwards. And the Europeans, especially, were seeking harder narcotics. And India was a place where you could find morphine quite easily because we produce morphine for pharmaceutical purposes. And in those years, everything that was produced wasn't highly guarded. So there was a lot of leakage. And because of that, the Western travelers or the junkies, which were now a little different from the hippies, could get access to this. And for some years, I had a troubled life growing up, and I was experimenting with various kinds of drugs, including trying to shoot up, which didn't sort of sit well with me, thank God. But I befriended this Danish woman in a small hotel, which is the sort of backpacker ghetto next to the New Delhi railway station. Paharganj is the name of the place. And there are all these little rooms you can rent. And this girl was one of the junkies, and she used to shoot. And I asked her, would you mind if I photographed you? And I want to do it in this sort of, manner where I want to just record from the time you take one fix and then what happens and then into your next. So it's a cyclic 8 pictures, which shows her from being kind of more normal, getting up, making a fix with the spoon and the candle, and then sucking it up into the syringe, and then, of course, injecting herself.
Right.
So that's basically the 8 pictures. It's there on the World Press Photo website as the sequence,
Yeah.
which was edited. Of course, there was a lot of other material around it. And there were two of them, in fact, though one of them is less seen. And I think she was English.
Mm-hmm. It's very powerful imagery. It's a very powerful series. So, in addition to photographing the goings on in Delhi, you also captured life on the streets in Bombay and Calcutta. Can you talk about those 3 cities and what they were like back then and how they've evolved?
The thing is that I had a large network of friends. I mean, there were friends in Bombay. I had a girlfriend in Bombay. There were friends in Calcutta who were actors and were in the film industry. And because I principally worked first as a stills photographer, it took me traveling depending on the film.
Right, right.
The other thing is, because of my part Bengali heritage, I had a grandmother in Calcutta, and I used to go and visit her. So, in the show that I put together called Calcutta Diaries, I start with her and then get into the city. Then there's my first photo essay on Chinatown of Calcutta. There were a lot of Chinese that had come 20, 30 years ago over the ships as carpenters, masons, and set up tanneries. So for me, that documentation really meant exploring my marginal end. It was sort of interesting to see how marginalized they were. And in fact, they were very marginalized because in 1962, when we went to war with China, a lot of the Chinese were rounded up and put into camps, their businesses taken away, things like that. So that made them even more marginal. And I was curious to see how they coped with it and what they were doing with their lives. And this area was a bunch of tanneries. And then the last part is really my working with the great film director Satyajit Ray. I worked on set with him on one film completely, which was The Chess Players. And then we became kind of friends. So he was much older, and he said to me, listen, you want to come back anytime on my set, you're welcome. Obviously, meaning giving me access, not giving me work, but just having access was
Right.
good enough. I could always get a magazine to pitch a story if I had the access. So over the years, I've photographed him in multiple sets, and he's been an integral part of my learning process because he's one of those filmmakers who wrote the script, he did the music, he used to do like comic book illustration of all the shot breakdowns. He actually shot his own films at a later stage.
Yeah.
So he was behind the camera,
Wow.
and did music and costumes and whatever. So he was really a Renaissance man in that manner. And to have such a great stalwart to watch was amazing. What it did do for me is it convinced me that I don't want to go into film uh, because I'm not a group activity person.
Uh-huh.
However, he did show me by observation that there are so many muses that you need to learn and be able to use, which again was something which was quite daunting. And I decided filmmaking is not for me, but this camera, travel, document, and that's what,
Yeah.
you know.
There are other
Yeah.
ways to make a living. But did Satyajit Ray give you feedback on your work that helped you conceptually?
Not really, but I did present him a book I did for the Red Cross, which was a small book of all the various cyclones and floods where the Red Cross would operate. And I gave him a copy and he really liked it. So, I mean, it was an affirmation that, well, whatever I was doing was not bad. So, a nod from him was very encouraging.
Yeah. So you began working as a photojournalist in 1983.
Yes.
And among many other significant people and events, you documented the end of Indira Gandhi's rule, the aftermath of her assassination and funeral, and then the political rise of her son, Rajiv.
Right.
What kind of access did you have to these government leaders and momentous events?
Well, I mean, Indira Gandhi was more difficult because I was just starting up. It's like, let's say, if you are thrown into the White House as a press photographer and you're in that pool, takes you maybe a few weeks, maybe even month to sort of figure out your whole standing and how it operates and what have you.
Right.
So there was some feet finding and things like that. And Mr. Gandhi, at least for me, was more like a distant leader. I could get close, but not greatly close. And then, of course, she was assassinated. Her son is somebody who I became close to because of two things. Rajiv was a photographer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had been gifted a Leica, and I also used Leica. So we would swap lenses. He didn't have a 21 wide angle. Plus, coming from a family that worked in culture, his mother knew my father. So that was one link. With Rajiv, the thing was that when he came into power, he wanted to have international exposure as much as possible. And I worked with Liaison at that time, or the Gamma Liaison Network.
Right.
And that agency link provided the government and their propaganda machine the right wheels. So I got taken to a lot of places with him. Plus, he was frustrated with the government photographers. A, they were never good shooters. Two, they would just get sloppy and lazy or whatever. And he said, hang these guys, when I have agency photographers who are willing to work and perform, why should I not use them? So they changed the rules. They stopped taking the government guys.
Huh.
and took us. So it wasn't just exclusively me. Sigma got a slot, Contact got a slot, Magnum got a slot, I got a slot. But I seem to have been in his favor, because when my father died in 85, I got a letter from him. And I wrote back, and his mother had died a few months ago. So there was another kind of exchange at that level. So the fact is that I had access.
Yeah.
I had access to the morphine addicts, I had access to the prime minister. I've been with him to Havana and photographed him with Castro, Maggie Thatcher in England, and Reagan in the US, and Gorbachev in Moscow. So it was a heady time for me.
Yeah.
And the agency was super happy that I had all this access.
It's also interesting how you described the shift from the government photographers to the agencies. And that was a time when the agencies were coming into their own and at the top of their game. So I think it was a real time of shift in how the media operated. Beyond that, the big photo that made your career was in 1984 when you documented the devastating chemical leak at the Union Carbide factory in Bhopal. And you spent several weeks photographing the early aftermath. I know it took you a couple of days to get there after the accident was announced. How did the site you arrived at compare to the news that you had heard?
Well, there's one image which remains etched in my head. I was at this small eating house outside a railway station, quite far away from Bhopal. And on this black and white TV was a shot of a crossroad, and there were these hand carts being pushed and pulled from different sections of this crossroad with bodies piled up on it. It was like one of those surreal films like Buñuel or something like that. I have never forgotten that. And I said, my God, what is going on? And I have to get there.
Mm-hmm.
The other image, which of course I was too late for, was the first day and the second day. In the hospital grounds, they had bodies piled up. So it was a bit like a concentration camp. The images that I saw later, but by the time I got there, it was already day 3, and they had put a tent up and got more organized. So that kind of shot was not possible. So these are the two shots that remain. What remains is what you didn't get.
Right. Did you face any health risks due to lingering contamination?
No, not really, because gas is air driven and goes off. The leakage only was for maybe 6-8 hours, which created havoc for many of the residents of Bhopal. But Bhopal is a landscape where you have small hills and lakes. So depending on what pocket you were in, you were kind of shielded. The intensity that really went straight smack in were the poor slum hutments opposite the factory. They bore the brunt.
Right.
And as people may know, MIC, as it's known, is a gas that, though it hasn't still been put out what the composition of this gas was, it's been kept secret.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It burnt soft lung tissue and your eye tissues. So people had great respiratory ailments depending on how much exposure they had, and they had their eyes burnt. Some recovered, others were blinded for life. So these were the two major things. And of course, people didn't get compensation because the government sold out to the big corporation. Though one of the funny things is some of the biggest ambulance chaser American lawyers all showed up in 4 days.
Wow.
They made all these illiterate people sign up to do a class action suit, which never happened because the government of India quell that. Otherwise, Union Carbide may have suffered much, much worse than it did.
Right. So one of your photos was selected as Photo of the Year by the World Press Photo Awards in 1985. And this image put you on the map and led to professional success, but you've referred to it as a crown of thorns and a ghost that haunts you. I can understand how the success of such a tragic image can provoke a sense of remorse, but I'm curious to know how this picture was received locally in Bhopal. Was the notoriety this photo achieved helpful to the victims in any way, or were they able to see it as such?
Well, I went back for the first anniversary, the second, and the third. I tried very hard to locate the family. I tried through local newspapers also, where they made an article and wrote for the family of this child to come forward. But unfortunately, nobody did. So, in one level, it was received very well because it became the symbol. And when there are protests, people need symbols to rally around.
Right.
So from that point of view, it became that icon that, everybody gravitated to. And on one level or the other, it symbolized the horror because you can see those glazed eyes. And that's the burn from the gas.
Right.
And then obviously the child must have inhaled and his lungs must have collapsed. There's great frustration because had justice been done, I would have felt, okay, photojournalism can still change things. I think that era of photojournalism changing things ended post-Vietnam War. We have become kind of dead to these images. There's been so much over the years that people have turned away and they are not affected. Plus, I think there's a far greater amount of escapism now, and that reflects in the magazine and editorial industry where people go for fluff,
Right.
which is easier to digest than something like Bhopal. I, in fact, was very pleased that it got included in Life magazine's 150 years of photography. In the few opening pages, they did a double spread, and that was very gratifying, but that's on a personal level. But on a larger level, I couldn't say that my image changed something.
As you said, you've returned to Bhopal over the years to document the longer-term effects of this environmental tragedy. What are your thoughts, given that 2024 will mark 40 years since the event took place?
I have a sadness because there are so many who still suffer. There are all sorts of other medical complications that I witnessed, like people who are born with all sorts of skin disease. And you have people who are 18, even 20, that look like they were 11.
Wow.
So there has been some mutation somewhere. And there's not enough study being done to really figure out what the gas did and how it affected different people in so many different ways. So in that sense, Bhopal is an ongoing work of horror which still unfolds.
It's sort of a canary in a coal mine.
Right.
So in 1992, you photographed the destruction of the Babri Masjid, which is a sacred site that was a cause for dispute between Hindu and Muslim communities. And you narrowly escaped being killed during this assignment due to an angry mob attacking members of the media. You've mentioned failures of the media in some of the talks you've given. Do you have a sense of what conditions are like for photojournalists and other media workers in India today?
Well, I still keep in touch. But the problem really is that Photojournalism per se has changed worldwide. I started in 83. By 84, I had the World Press Photo.
Yeah.
So I became, as the London end of the photo agency said to me, you're on every lip of any photo editor in the world. In my time, there were two separations. One was the magazine world, which we, as the photo agency, worked in. And then you had the wires that worked the newspapers. And there was this big separation until, of course, the 90s when the internet came. And then the wire services became full service agencies. So in India, we have either staff jobs at the newspapers, and those also coming down very rapidly, where there would be a big newspaper that may have 15 photographers all over the country. Now they have maybe half that amount. And more is being bought from the wires that offer full service, whether to magazines or newspapers. And the representation of the image itself has fallen in quality because very few photographers are put out into the field for a long period of time. So if you just go in and go bang, bang and shoot something and bring it back, that's good enough. But nobody's going deeper and exploring, and there is no money except maybe when there are wars. Then the budgets all go. If whoever wants to risk themselves, I mean, the whole nature has changed.
Yeah.
I remember started noticing the change when Yugoslavia disintegrated. And a lot of young photographers jumped into their cars and drove across Europe to photograph all of this. And many died because they weren't prepared as to what the conditions are going into this sort of situation or knew how the whole thing was skewed.
Right.
So, you can want to be a hero.
So did that early recognition with that Bhopal image affect the way you thought about covering future assignments or taking pictures based on the notoriety you got from that one image?
Not really, because, India was a roller coaster of all sorts of stories, good and bad. So there was something always going on. And the West was extremely interested in India at that time. And I guess now the interest is less.
Interesting. So before we go to a break, let's talk about gear for a minute. You started working back in the days of analog cameras in film. What was your go-to camera gear back then? You mentioned Leica. Did you shoot with anything else?
Well, I started with a humble box camera at age 9 or whatever, and then went on to the Russian clones of the rangefinder cameras like Zorky and Zenith. But I had access to my father's Leicas all the time and his film, because he would buy 100-foot rolls that you could then spool off onto the 35mm cassettes.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact is that if you pinched a few rolls, he would not know. And then I stayed with the Nikons, the F mount and the Nicomats, the FM2s, all of those. So, there's a whole graveyard of cameras that I still have here, which is sitting, but it's just that I'm kind of attached. I mean, I'm stupid because people say, hey, you should have sold it right then.
Film photography is coming back. It's crazy how popular it is in the States right now with young kids.
Maybe I should bring a suitcase of my analog and go to B&H and say, hey.
So at what point did you transition to digital gear, and what are you working with now?
It was the late 90s when the terrible Nikon D100 came about, and one was forced. The two bad purchases were the D100, but there was no other digital camera. It was slow, 6 megapixel. And the other thing is my photo agency forced me to buy a terrible Mac with OS 9, which had to go back in a year to Austin, Texas, because they recalled that model.
Oh my goodness.
Right. So it was terrible, both computer and camera. But things got better. I think the last Nikon that I had was the D850. And at that point, I chose to reassess, and I figured out that I think Sony is the way, the mirrorless. And I did my background research and all of that. And I found that the sensors were provided to Nikon by Sony.
Right.
And when I looked at the Sony models and I found so many more features than whatever the Nikon had, I figured, why do I want to be waiting for a year to get the next update of the sensor rather than just buy Sony? And then Sony made me an ambassador, which helped in acquiring more gear.
Mm.
So I did buy a Leica M10 out of vanity. Because I've used the M's, I have the M6s, I have M3s, M2s, M4s. So I said, well, there are all these lenses lying around. Let me just get the body.
So what model Sony do you have currently?
I principally use the A7R4, which is a 61 megapixel. I like big megapixel because if I'm shooting and I want to blow up, I would like at least something that I can print without things breaking up. As a purist of the megapixel, one might as well have the best.
Right. So heat and humidity must be ongoing challenges when you're working in India. Do you have tips for mitigating damage to your gear under those conditions?
Yeah, you have to keep it in the humidity control boxes.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few of them. Then I have other cupboards where I put a light bulb for all the accessories which have no glass but have electronics, and humidity and heat can affect those too.
Mm-hmm. And what does the light bulb do?
A 0-watt bulb inside a sealed metal cupboard will pretty much bring humidity down because of the low heat. It's a poor man's storage. We've used that for years.
I've never heard of that before. That's interesting.
Mm.
What about image storage, both analog and digital?
For the digital, I have a Synology RAID and I'm running out of space and I need to up that. I also try and triple backup on humongous hard drives and then pop them out and keep them in another location. So that's on the digital end. The slides I've had more problems with, and in fact, in the next 6 months, I've made it my mission to go through all the slides that I have and get them scanned as fast as possible on a Hasselblad X5 because there is no drum scanning here in India.
You had a very unfortunate but interesting situation happen with some of your archival slides that were adversely affected by water damage, and then you found termites.
Right.
But you were able to turn those ruined slides into new work.
Yeah. The exhibition called Memento Mori. That really broke me. It was a National Geographic shoot. In retrospect, I always cursed National Geographic because they always kept the stuff that they ran, the originals, unlike the deal that they have with Magnum where they return everything. So I was in retrospect grateful that they had at least the spread, and they were very kind to share high resolution scans of those images. So the entire take that ran in the magazine I have, in a way, it was a learning curve that, yeah, unless you really look after your stuff, things are going to deteriorate and fall off. So not only do I have my archive, I have my father's black and white archive and some color. I would ideally like to, at some point, give it to a university or an organization which can keep all this to great archival standards, but I don't know where that will be.
Well, Pablo, I hope your archive finds a home where it can be accessible to the public. On that note, we're going to pause here for a short break. And when we come back, we'll speak more with Pablo Bartholomew about his images and insights on the culture of India. Stay tuned. I hope you're enjoying this chat with Pablo Bartholomew as part of my series, Picturing World Cultures. In the show's second half, we'll hear about Pablo's treks to northeastern India and his documentation of indigenous customs and rituals within the Naga tribes. But first, I want to make sure you know about our recent integration with B&H Photo's YouTube channel, conveniently located under the podcast tab. Pay us a visit, and while you're there, please leave a comment about your favorite episodes. I'll get the ball rolling by posting a remark about this very show. From there, it's your turn to add your voice. We'll be monitoring the conversation as it builds, and we'll give our favorite comments an on-air shout-out. We consider our listeners an integral part of every episode, and we're truly grateful for your ratings, reviews, and engagement. And make sure to stay tuned for my next installment of Picturing World Cultures coming up in August. Okay, we are back with Pablo Bartholomew and his stories about documenting the many facets of India over nearly 50 years. Let's jump to your photographs of the Naga tribes in northeastern India. In 1989, you began a 10-year project in this area, which is near the border of present-day Myanmar. How much time did you spend photographing in Nagaland, and how long did you stay during any one trip?
I think the maximum time that I spent uninterrupted was about 120 days, so that's 4 months. But usually it was 2 months, 3 weeks, all depending on how much time I could get away. And I mean, the agency would get very frustrated with me, but they were very tolerant. This is like an antidote to photojournalism with all the horrors that I would come across. The exhilaration of being in your four-wheel drive, where I had a generator and lighting gear all in a customized vehicle. I could set up a mini studio anywhere, indoor, outdoor. And a lot of the influence came from Irving Penn.
Oh, interesting.
His work on Papua New Guinea and the African countries always fascinated me. I wanted to represent them at times in this lit environment where they got represented as people who were important and beautiful, and stylistically photographing them with lights, soft boxes, umbrellas, all that sort of stuff.
Wow. But there was a personal connection to your interest in the Naga tribes, and that came from childhood stories that you heard from your father, who had encountered the tribes during his flight to India from Burma during World War II.
Yes.
Is there any one story from your father that's particularly memorable?
Well, there are a few. Unfortunately, some I may not want to describe publicly because it has to do with the food and the way they ate certain things. And I don't want to be disrespectful because, sometimes these things come across in a certain light. But principally, what I couldn't wrap my head around was that headhunters, they're supposed to be these ferocious people. Why would they let fair game pass through their backyard to the degree where they would provide food and shelter? So there was in this savage something very kind. And I wanted to find out what the contradiction was. But it's not as clear cut because I befriended Naga students who came to Delhi University to study.
That was your way in?
Well, to some degree, I used to go and visit them there even before I started the project. And they would take me to their villages. And these were mainly wealthier Nagas whose parents were in the government or were officials or were politicians, because those were the ones who could afford to send their kids to university in the capital city of Delhi. So through them, there was some contact and familiarity. Also, in the mid 80s, Time Life Books, of which I've done two, were doing a series on great tribes of the world. And I had been assigned the Nagas, and we got quite far up with the paperwork and discussing how and what we could do. And then came the bad news that the series has been cancelled. Even though that didn't happen, I still needed to go. As I said, it was a time for escape. So I didn't know at that time in 1989 how to drive.
Oh, wow.
Well, we never had a car, immigrant parents, what have you. So I would take drivers and I would be the co pilot. But I got fed up with the drivers from the planes because somebody had problems getting up at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., because you've got to drive to catch the light,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I just, I learned driving on the fly in one of the Second World War abandoned airstrips.
Huh.
I just got into the vehicle and, stumbled with the clutch and the gear till I was okay. And after a couple of times of going up and down with the vehicle, I was able to find places to park it, especially in the tea gardens, because in the valley of Assam, the Brahmaputra Valley, you have a huge tea estates which were British run, and they're still active. And I had fortunately friends who were managers, and some of these gardens were so big that they had their own small planes, which when the big bosses would arrive, they would fly to the nearest airport, commercial airport, and then ferry them into the tea garden. So it was nice to be able to leave the vehicle there. It would be looked after. I was fortunate in that way to be able to park it and be able to work over a long stretch of time.
The Time Life book that you mentioned, which got canceled, was there research done for that project you could use?
Not really. The thing is that when you get obsessive about some things, I was already reading the old anthropological literature that existed on the Nagas. There was a great anthropologist called Führer von Heimendorf, based out of the UK. He lived in the Naga Hills for many years, and then he wrote a book called The Naked Nagas. To meet Führer von Heimendorf in the UK was a big deal. I went through various museums. There's the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which has all his collection and documentation. The Cambridge University's anthropological department had done a lot of work with the Nagas. So I was traveling a lot to the UK those days, and I was able to meet people, talk to them, read, see things, and that was the research.
So on your first visits, how did people respond to your camera and the idea of you taking pictures not only just with your camera, but with a whole lighting setup? Was there any acclimation period, or did you proceed slowly or methodically with setting up shots?
Well, I think having built up a network over the years prior to going in, I already was prepared as to what I was going to expect. I knew that I would have to use interpreters. And as it would happen, the Nagas are many, many tribes, and each tribe has its own language. So one tribe doesn't understand the other tribe's language, and they have a lingua franca called Nagamese, which is a mixture of Assamese, some Naga words, English, Hindi, But each district head, or the collector as it's known, had interpreters. You would set up the interpreter well in advance so that he could take you in, and he would speak Hindi or broken English. And that institution has been around from the British time. And there's a term for these people. They're called Dobashi. So
Hmm.
these were the two language people who were basically interpreters and were employees of the collectorate. And each district you went to, you had them set up so that then they could escort you into the village, which helped because they were recognized, the folk that came in through the government administration. You always had to go to the village council or the village headman, depending on what tribe followed what format, and seek permission. Once that permission was given, they would know that you are all right and you could work. Of course, there were things you had to approach with caution and sensitivity, like their graves. Many of them have turned to Christianity, but I was looking at the animist side. So, again, if you were going to a village grave where they suspend the bodies of the dead onto these long kind of balconies, and then a hut is built, and all the personal ornamentation and clothing of the deceased is kept in that space.
Hmm.
You would have to find whose grave it was, seek permission from the individual family.
Mm-hmm.
But once you had the consent of the village council, the elders, or the headman, it was easy enough. And by that time, photography hadn't come in such a popular form that you were a pest.
Right, right. So you mentioned you were looking at the animist side of Naga life. Can you give us a brief description of what the animist spirituality is?
Well, for one, they believe in their own symbols. They don't call it gods and goddesses, but there are animal figures,
Mm.
reptiles, monkeys, tiger, and they believe that each one of their spirits also lives in them.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these books that you read where you have this spiritual connection between a tiger and a certain specific person in the village. And if the tiger is being hunted and is wounded, then the person would also feel that pain.
Mm-hmm.
How much of it is true, but these are accounts that I've read. I personally never encountered the animal spirit people, but was told about it.
Mm-hmm.
Many practices diluted because of the Christian missionaries coming in and converting, and that
Right.
mission still continues. So, for me, what was important was to be able to document as much as possible. For example, I have this spectacular shot of one village chief in front of a huge set of heads, rows of them. And the next year I went back, I said, maybe I can improve. And the son of the chief said, we've had to hide them because of the Baptist church's pressure.
Wow.
So, I consider myself lucky that I was able to witness something that completely changed a year later.
Yeah, documenting disappearing culture.
Mm.
So within the Naga identity, there's several indigenous tribes, as you said, and they're similar in traits, but each one is distinct. Can you elaborate on some of the distinctions in customs?
The common traits is headhunting.
Mm.
The less common but quite prevalent is the log drum. The log drum is carved out of a single tree, and it's a very specific kind of tree that they go and find. And then the trunk is pulled from the jungle midway where it's carved. Once it's carved, it's pulled into the village and kept in what they call the morung, which is the male dormitory. And the male dormitory has many purposes, like if there is a fire, then the log drum is beaten. Or if there was festivity, then it's beaten in a different way to be celebratory. Or more recently, because this is the longest insurgency, the Nagas never wanted to join Burma or India. So when the Indian army was around and sending their troops in, there would be the drums beaten. But the log drum represents a canoe. And so there are anthropological theories that this canoe was a vehicle that brought the Nagas from as far as Papua New Guinea into maybe the Philippines, Indonesia, and then they migrated further overland, northern Thailand, Vietnam, and then finally made their homes in the Naga Hills. And each of the tribes has different stories of their migration. Or some believe that they came from a stone, where I have photographed this amazing male and female stone. There is a vagina-like shape, and through that is a phallic stone. And I was lucky enough to shoot it very dramatically using one of these old battery-powered flashes that you could trigger remotely. In the old days, we used these gutted out Vivitars with a round bulb put into it. Somebody in Queens used to make it. And you could trigger it with a wireless trigger. A lot of photojournalists used it because it was easy to manipulate. And if you were shooting a politician, this one light would help as a kicker or a fill or a main light. And the wattage was much higher than the normal flash and camera. So I was able to place this under the stone and light it. So it's quite dramatic. How did the local people react to flash and strobe? Was it surprising to them, disturbing, or? I think the way I connected with them and I explained my intention and what I was doing, and of course, the backstory of my father and what have you, many of them were very, very patient, collaborative, and happy. And I carried a Polaroid in those days. I had a Fuji foldable camera with lots of Polaroid film, and wherever I could, I would do a Polaroid and leave it with them, and then promise to give them back photos later. When was the last time that you were there? I was there about 2, 3 years ago. But the thing is, where I was photographing, it's far away. I've been to the state capital, and in December, 1st to 6th of December, they have a Naga festival where they bring in all the tribes. They all shipped in and they jump around. And then they have a village set up with the different tribes and their huts and the shapes and types. But that's sort of more tourism, and it saddens me. It's like a zoo. Yeah. Yeah. But I got kind of adopted by a group of DNA scientists because one of my projects is in DNA. And in the last 4 years, whenever they've had a conference, they've asked me to come and present my DNA work and the Northeastern work. I guess it gives them some bridge with the local people. These are scientists who are looking into ancient DNA. So they're trying to pick up clues from burial sites, which are archaeologically quite old. Also, experiments like going into the very remote areas and doing DNA analysis of what people eat in their natural habitat, and then doing DNA analysis of the modern Naga in the city and what he eats, which is everything from Coke and chips and pizzas and what have you, and looking at how DNA may have changed between these two groups. So I went for a DNA conference, and they, of course, positioned it during the festival because they wanted all the visitors. I never went.
Right, right.
I mean, I've been to it before when it had started many years ago, and it was much humbler and much more endearing. But now it's become too much of a
sideshow.
Right.
But you mentioned that there were some things that you were not able to photograph that you still would like to. Can you talk about that?
Well, I may be now too late.
Mm-hmm.
Certain animist rituals which don't exist.
Yeah.
Around death, birth, the coming of manhood, which is probably the easiest to talk about because at every stage, a male or a female would get tattoos. If you were a warrior and you were a great hunter and you proved yourself, then you would get a certain kind of marking. Whether it's on your arms, on your ankles for women, the chin for women, or the chest for men. The Nagas are very visual. You could look at somebody and know
what their accomplishments were.
Yeah, what they have achieved, including in their jewelry. So you would have the old folk wear 4 heads of bronze or brass as a necklace. And that meant that that person had taken 4 heads. Or the kind of textile or fabric that they could wear also signified what they had been able to achieve. And achieving doesn't necessarily mean headhunting, but let's say if you are wealthy and you have a lot of animals, you sacrifice some of the animals and you share it within the village, which then goes through the whole village. And thereby, you get a certain status as somebody who is of wealth, but is also being able to share.
Right.
Many of this is all broken down.
Yeah.
So, it's difficult, and I just may have left it too late, but I'm happy with what I have.
So is there one Naga tribe that you found particularly memorable when it comes to celebrations or festivals that you photographed?
I think the Konyaks, which, they call them backward, but which are the most sort of animist, and I wouldn't like to use the term primitive, but their New Year festival, which is in April, is interesting because a lot of it had to do with the bringing out of human skulls, which in a certain part of the Konyak, again, within one tribe, there would be north, south, and they would follow different rituals. In the southern Konyaks, they would dress up the head with horns of a buffalo or an ox-like creature called a mithun. And then they would hang them on these huge, long bamboo poles. That was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, sounds it.
It could take you back thousands of years.
And you said the New Year was in April.
It all has to do with harvest.
Right. So would that be springtime?
Yeah. Then they start to sow.
Right. And you mentioned this word Konyaks. What is that exactly?
Konyak is one of the tribes.
Ah, I see.
Okay. There are many tribes. There's Angami, Tangkol, Konyak, Sangtam, Chakasang, Lotha. So these are the many, many, many different tribes. There are about 30.
Wow. That's fascinating. So let's shift gears from the Naga to talk about another project that you've done, photographing Indian emigres in different countries.
Yes.
You photographed in the U.S., in France, as well as in England, Mauritius, and Portugal. You're documenting Indian nationals who have moved to these different countries. And what, if any, differences have you found among your subjects who have emigrated to these different countries?
Okay, so I started my Indian emigre in 1987 in America. I had a grant from the Asian Cultural Council, which used to be known as John D. Rockefeller III Fund. They give money to artists from Asia to come over. And basically, what they provide is, at that time, was a gallery and museum visiting program.
Hmm.
When I arrived there, I said to them, listen, I go to the museums and galleries anyway. I've been coming to America for several years. I'd like to use the money in this form. They said, we're giving you the money, you do what you want.
Mm.
For me, what was interesting is I'd heard about the farmers that were in California. At that time, there were two very well known newspapers, small tabloid sized newspapers. So I made friends with the journalists in the editorial desk, and I would look at all their back issues and things like that and figure out who were the interesting Indians. It didn't mean they had to be prosperous. And one of the things that was of historical interest was the Indians north of Sacramento in California, Yuba City,
Hmm.
to be precise. And around Yuba City, there were huge farmlands of peaches that the Sikh community were given money by the American canneries in the 50s when canned food started getting very popular. It may have been even in the 40s. And they were given money to buy land and grow peaches. So I went to this group to photograph. And then I sat in the California archives and looked at what other stuff I could look at. And what caught my eye was the mixed marriages between Mexicans and Indians.
Huh.
So you had a name like Mario Singh. And the reason for this is that all these guys, workers who came after building the Panama Canal and walked up through Mexico into the US, worked $1 a day on the farmland, saved up, started buying their tracts of land, farming, and they encountered Mexican women who they probably had some kind of liaisons with because many of these men came on their own. But what actually was the trigger is after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America passed a law called Alien Land Laws, which were basically targeting Japanese who owned farmlands and other property to take them over. But somewhere this law had a wider application and all Asian lands were taken over.
Huh.
But before this could happen, the Indians were quite smart and they married their Mexican worker
Ah.
and transferred their
Uh-huh.
title to their names and saved their property.
Interesting. Wow.
These are the kind of stories that then you ride on to find examples of mixed marriages and
Mhm.
things like that.
So, what about the Indian immigrants in the other countries you've photographed? Are there any distinctions to what you found?
So the thing is that I did America as a rash of everybody and everything. And at the end of the day, America is a melting pot
Right.
of all sorts of ethnicities, religions, races that come together. So I photographed right from Silicon Valley, Bell Labs, the technology end of it, to the scientists. But coming to your question, in the other countries, I started looking for specificity because I didn't want to do this mishmash of everybody all over the place. So, for example, I picked up after many years when I found funding. Part of doing all of this is finding the funding.
Right.
In France, I said, how am I going to look at the Indian community? And what kind of migration has taken place. So I looked at the migration that came to France from the French departments, and departments means overseas territories. Like you could even call Mauritius their overseas department. Then you have in the Pacific, Guadeloupe and Martinique. Closer in the Indian Ocean to Africa, you have Reunion. So these are still controlled by France.
Right.
And to these islands were indentured labor, which is a polite form of slavery, taken for sugarcane farming. So these people, several generations later, have come to France to again step up their game, because in these islands you can only go so far. So for me, it was interesting to document that group of people. The origin of looking at these people were people who originally were taken from India into a migratory slave labor environment, and now they have come to mothership.
They were able to sort of get beyond the limitations of their caste, let's say.
Not necessarily caste. Maybe they didn't have such a bad life. But the fact is, people want their children to go to better institutions. I always call my project the Indian emigres. I do not call them diaspora because I don't know. I'm old school. The diasporic meaning for me, which has changed, it seems, meant people who have lost land. And for me, these are economic migrants who have come to better their life. So the last place I did was Portugal. And for the Portuguese, I looked at the Goan community. They came from Goa. Goa was part of Portugal till 1961.
Oh, right.
Okay, it was the last bastion to fall. And many Goans who had allegiance to the Portuguese felt that they had to leave or wanted to leave. They felt it was an invasion, not a liberation as we look at it. And they left. I chased that group and photographed them. I started looking at specificities rather than everything and everybody, though the everybody and everything also comes in because you can't help it. The Indian community, on one level, there are huge crossovers.
Right. So, in summary, is there any one country or group of people that you found to have assimilated best?
Yeah, America, obviously, because America takes in fresh blood. You start from the busboy and become a restaurant owner if you can. You know, it gave you that huge mobility that in half a generation or a generation, you could up your game and become something else.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it's a fascinating way to look at what happens to a culture as it spreads.
Well, again, the impetus to doing this was both my parents are migrants in that sense, so in a much smaller geographical level. But for me, basically, it's looking at what you bring with you, which is the customs, the religion, the food, the clothing, and then what do you assimilate?
Right.
It's easier if I was doing a PhD and writing about it, but you try to find that visual contradiction or something that can illustrate in a good visual the ideas. And it comes all from, again, the displacement of my parents.
Fascinating. Well, Pablo, I think we've reached the end of our questions and learned so much about Indian culture through speaking with you today. Thank you for sharing your experiences and knowledge of India with us, and your insights about making pictures there.
Yeah.
But before we go, I'd like to end with a short visual questionnaire inspired by the TV show Inside the Actors Studio. It's a brief list of questions with one-sentence answers. So, Pablo Bartholomew, with all things being equal, what's your preference, black and white or color?
Black and white is really my preference.
So, which image orientation do you gravitate to more often? Horizontal, vertical, or square?
I'm a horizontal person.
Interesting.
Uh,
And what's your lens preference, prime or zoom?
Unfortunately, I have become spoiled. I use zooms more purely because I crop in camera and then that's the frame. I then don't crop in post.
Yeah.
So the zoom sort of tends to work for me.
Right. And if you could only carry one lens, which would it be?
Either a 35 1.4 or a 28 f2.
What's the most important thing you look for at the instant when you click the shutter?
It's an automatic process. It's not like you're looking and you say, I have all the elements. There's something that is a feeling, and I can't define it. Sometimes there's a feeling in your stomach, and you know that you have the makings of a very strong and interesting image.
Yeah. And what one photographer, living or dead, has influenced your work the most?
I hate to disappoint you. Of course, it's my father. But when I say disappoint you, it's not the greats. It's not André Cortez, or it's not Bresson or Brassai. Though all of these people have had seminal influences. But when I was growing up, there was a photographer called Kishore Parekh, who I wouldn't say mentored me, but he was a friend of my father's and he was a photojournalist. And in his later years, based himself out of Hong Kong. And every time he came to India, I would get to be his assistant and carry his bags around and hand him lenses, and we got to talk. So it's all about at a certain age and who triggers what.
Right.
Rather than the larger academic visual of the great masters. I think Kishore Parekh was much more seminal as an influence. And he did one great body of work on the liberation of Bangladesh, which is a lesser known book, but it beats all photojournalists. It's just that sometimes people get lost. And Kishore got lost and historically is not understood or known. But that book is an amazing witness to the birth of Bangladesh.
Well, it's something that our listeners should look up for sure. So, other than photography, what profession or craft would you most like to explore?
Oh, that's a big dilemma. I don't know anything else. That's why I've stayed with photography.
That's fair. Finally, in a single word, what is your biggest motivation for making pictures?
Again, I don't know anything else. So it's my expression. At times it's been therapy. It's an ally and a friend. And it's a conversation that I can keep having without being told to shut up.
That's a beautiful way to sum things up. So, Pablo, what do you have any current or upcoming projects that you're working on that our listeners might want to know about?
Well, I'm editing my 20 years of photojournalism because the thing is that, you can continue to create new projects. My last project, the DNA project on one tribe in 3 countries, has been received very well, and I could continue expanding on that. But what I've come to realize is with the fragility of film and negatives. I need to do something about that. Plus, I'm the least published photographer. Part of it is I've had a love-hate relationship with publishing.
Mm.
Even my father's book, 640-page book on his writings on art, I funded myself, and it's been a fairly good success. I don't know if I'll go the self-publishing route again, but I'm considering it.
Mm.
But I would like to have several documents out in the next 5 years to a decade, because that's the way you leave a legacy.
Yeah, make a mark. Well, we'll definitely look forward to seeing more of that work coming out. And where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
I am not very active on Instagram, but I have tried to put a smattering of various things on it.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, the Instagram bio has all sorts of external links.
Great. And those links will be posted in our show notes. Pablo Bartholomew, thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing stories about the many facets of Indian culture you've captured over the years. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, we'd love to hear about it. Pull up this episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H Photo's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, don't forget to leave us a rating and review, and make sure that subscribe button is clicked for automatic updates about every episode release. You can also find us and drop us a line on the Explora blog, where we post photos from our guests along with the show notes. And if you're a fan of social media, please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comment about the show. I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast creative producer and host of this series. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Theme music for this series is composed by Gabriel Richards, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of us all, thanks so much for listening.